Hi everybody, Ethan Dre here with another Photoshop tutorial. In today's tutorial, we'll be introducing very basic animation within Photoshop. As you can see, I've set up a basic eye blink here, and this is what we're going to be creating in today's tutorial. I've created all of this imagery using a combination of the pen tool, different shape tools, and obviously the direct selection tool. Notice all of my layers are shapes. That way I can use the direct selection tool to move my anchor points and line segments around and edit these shapes as we animate. If you haven't already, you might want to watch my pen tool tutorial, my tutorial on the different types of anchor points, and introducing Photoshop animation setting up your workspace. Alright, before we start animating, let's do some housekeeping. I want to group all of the layers and shapes that are not going to be moving in my animation. That way I can have a little bit more space to work on my timeline as well as my layer panel. I'm going to left click to select tear duct, and I'm going to go ahead and hold in Shift on my keyboard and select the white layer as well. That way it selects the first layer, the last layer, and all of the layers in between. From here I'm just going to left click and hold and drag these layers down to the group. That way they're grouped automatically, and I'm just going to rename this group Static Imagery. As you can see, we already have a lot more room in our layer panel, which is going to be important here soon, as well as our timeline. With that being said, notice all of our layers here in our timeline, which is a video timeline, are also layers in our layer panel. Now very quickly, if I go to the bottom left of my video timeline and I click on these three little frames here, that's going to convert my timeline to a frame-by-frame animation. For right now, we're going to stick to our video timeline, and all you're going to do is click on that icon again to revert back to your video timeline. The next thing I want to do is turn my pupil and iris into a smart object. So left clicking and holding in Shift to select both layers, I am then going to right click and I'm going to convert to smart object. This way, we still have both of our layers intact, but we can move both of them at the same time without grouping them. This is going to allow us to animate the position of our eyeball a lot easier. Now that we have our timeline and our layer panel all cleaned up, maximizing the space in our application, we can start animating. Now obviously to see animation or motion, there has to be change in imagery. So we have our eyelid here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag this layer down to my create new layer icon. I'm going to rename this layer to eyelid 2. Now we're going to start making some changes to the anchor points and line segments of eyelid 2. That way we can begin the blinking process. I'm going to select my direct selection tool in my toolbox or keyboard shortcut A, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this path here. Notice my anchor points pop up. I'm going to left click to select the first one, and I'm going to hold in Shift to select the second one. Notice the selected anchor points are filled in with black, and the deselected anchor points have an empty fill. I'm then going to left click and drag these anchor points down a little bit so we're beginning that blink. That way whenever I hide my eyelid 2 layer, we can see that the blink has begun. I'm going to continue this process until the eye is completely closed. I've ended up with 6 separate eyelids here, one slightly more closed than the one before it. And for this last one, I'm just going to rename the shape closed. Now, instead of trying to bring these points all the way together and messing around with these different line segments, I'm going to go ahead and just remove all of these anchor points with the delete anchor point tool. That way we have one solid layer of skin tone. To do this, I'm just going to select that delete anchor point tool underneath the pen tool, and I'm going to hover over top of my anchor points and click. Okay, as you can see, we have all of our different layers here for our blink. Let's go ahead and extend our timeline upward a little bit. That way we have more space and we can see all of our layers. Now obviously there are no changes taking place because our layers are stacked on top of one another. They're also extended the entire length of the timeline. As I mentioned before, to see motion or animation, there has to be a change in imagery. So what we're going to do is reduce all of these layers to one frame, and we're going to stagger them one by one to display the blink that we have just created. There are a few ways to do this. We can start out by hovering over top of the end of the layer and just clicking and dragging. That way that layer is the length of one frame. Ideally, Photoshop would allow us to select all of these layers and reduce the size all at once. However, that's not the case. So instead, I'm going to zoom in on my timeline using our mountains down here, or you can just click and hold on that slider and drag it all the way in. That way we're zooming in on our individual frames as opposed to larger groups of frames, and we can see frame 1 here. Let's go ahead and click our playhead and drag it to frame 1, and I'm going to go ahead and select all of our eyelid layers that we've created by holding in Shift. From there, I'm going to go to the top right of our timeline, Click on this little drop down menu and we have split at playhead. Considering our playhead is set at 1 frame right now, we're just going to click split at playhead and notice that it splits all of our layers at the first frame and leaves everything left over. So now all we're going to do is delete the excess frames for these layers. To do that, all you have to do is left click and hit delete or backspace on your keyboard. Notice we still have eyelid 1 that is 2 frames long. I'm going to go ahead and reduce that to 1 frame. Now as you can see, since there is no eyelid on frame 2, we have our very basic empty imagery without that skin tone here. The next thing I'm going to do is start clicking and dragging these layers to the frame that they're indicating. So if I have eyelid 3, I'm just going to click and drag that to the 3rd frame over. This is where naming your layers comes in handy. Being organized is very important. It makes for a lot less clutter and confusion whenever you're working on your animation. If I grab my playhead and begin to scrub my timeline, you'll notice that our blink is starting to come together here pretty smoothly. However, if I exceed my last frame here, you'll notice that the eyelid and the skin tone layer completely disappears. There's a very easy fix to this. All we're going to do is hover over top of the end of this layer and click and drag to extend it. That way we have our skin tone and our eye closed a little bit longer here. Now as you can see, our timeline and our layer panel are beginning to get kind of cluttered. Obviously, if we continue this process, it's going to be impossible to pinpoint the right layer that we're trying to work with. However, this is why we have groups. So similar to whenever we grouped our static imagery, I'm going to go ahead and select my last layer, closed. I'm going to scroll down and select my first layer, eyelid 1. I'm just going to click and drag all of those layers to my create new group icon. And as you can see, just like that, we have a very clean workspace, a lot less clutter, and our animation is still there. I'm going to double click to rename this group close. And I'm actually going to duplicate this group by clicking and dragging it down to create new layer icon. Let's rename it open. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drop down our open folder. That way I see all of these different layers here. And I'm just going to start reversing the order of these layers by clicking and dragging them. So instead of going chronologically from 1 to 6, we're going to want to go from 6 to 1 here. Once we have all of those organized and in order, we can begin to drag our playhead and notice that the eye is blinking, closing, as well as opening. That concludes our Photoshop animation tutorial. Just a quick recap. We reviewed using layers and groups to better organize our timeline. We learned how to duplicate and alter our imagery to show motion in animation. We also learned how to reduce our layers to 1 frame and stagger them and reverse them to achieve a constant loop animation. This is Ethan Dre, and as always, thank you for watching, and please check back for more tutorials.